To speed things up, I would immediately open the round of questions, or otherwise also have some.
Sorry. Can you hear me? No. Do I press it? No? Oh, great. Okay, I have a question for David. Thanks for your talk, incredibly rich. So I'd like to ask, the sort of missing link maybe in your thoughts was where does the aesthetic of administration and this search for the metaphysical, where do they sort of come together? That's one thing. My second question is more to do with method. I think it's something we've all come across. It's clear that on the surface, you know, the aesthetic of administration and bureaucracy that you find in so much of Moscow conceptualism appears quite similar to similar things you find in the West at the same time. So it's very tempting to, and you didn't give in to this, but it's very tempting to simply supply, you know, an image of Kabakov with a quote from Buchloh and sort of say how strange it is that they are the same thing. But of course, as you yourself noted, the context for this aesthetic is very different in both cases and needs to be probably carefully passed. So I'm wondering, how can we do that? Now, for Buchloh, of course, what the neo-avant-garde in the West was doing was to enact a kind of late capitalist spectacle that served the needs of a re-emerging bourgeoisie eager to be pleased with means that often uncannily resembled those of the historical avant-garde. In the Soviet Union, things were very different, and I don't have an answer for this, but how come Kabakov's works are so bureaucratic, you know, look so administrative when he lived in an environment that was very different? And maybe it's not enough to just say with Boris Groys that was because the Soviet Union was so bureaucratic. I mean, it was, of course, but is there a more complex reason that we can adduce, as it were, to explain the phenomenon? And then for the second thing, as you know, as to what the connection would be between, you know, the metaphysics and the administration. Initially I was just going to say, well, as you know, there are all these painters in the 1970s that were so interested in things metaphysical and religious, and then you showed them yourself. So obviously there was that, but I wonder, you know, that doesn't quite yet explain the fact that even in Kabakov you find that, right? I was showing yesterday the big archive, and I was sort of trying to explain that these heaps of trash at the end, they're actually not just material trash, but I think they have something weirdly metaphysical about them. So the bureaucracy has that element, even it has that element of transcendence in it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I was wondering, you know, is there a missing link between these two, or do you see them as quite separate? Because, of course, the images of those painters that you showed from the 70s, they're not very bureaucratic. You know, they're mostly abstract paintings that lack this element of forms and lists and, you know, questionnaires, whatever, that you find in the conceptual works. Anyway.
It was an extended question. If you can have a concise answer, we will be grateful.
I agree. No, I suppose I'd just briefly say that I think it's perhaps been a little bit difficult and unfashionable to think about the kind of religiosity that permeates through lots of Soviet art in the 1970s. And a kind of simple way would be, and a wrong way I think, to simply divide those artists that use abstraction to try and talk about a kind of metaphysical sense of being in the world, and then those artists that deal with somehow the concrete reality of Soviet experience, reality if we want to use that word. And I'm kind of interested that they could be brought together in some attempt. So this is a bit of a beginning to do that. So I'm really sympathetic to the question, but I don't have a great answer. I think the other thing I'm very, very mindful of is absolutely not to put up, say, a Kabakov and then to find an equivalent piece of conceptual art from the period from the West, precisely because I'm really, really interested in the intellectual archaeology that could be done to try and think about what those artists were reading, what their frames of reference were, and they're really very often not the ones that one might assume from reading kind of Western art histories. So that's why Epstein's kind of interesting as a figure that you could really say he's doing the work of Derrida, But I don't want to say that because I think that would just be to kind of sort of dislodge the kind of core of his work.
Thank you. Any further questions in audience? Daniel?
Thank you for these contributions. They were all amazing. And I would like to ask David whether you came across parapsychology when you did research, because as far as I know, or has come with the publications from the time, it was widely distributed also as a kind of scientific tool, also as a tool of Cold War against the West. And this parapsychology is somehow related to occultism, and there is a certain relation to this post-atheistic religionism, and it was widely distributed at the time, mostly in 70s. And also I know about some cases in artists, that artists also appropriated this notion. And it could be also a kind of speculative question about the paper that Hannah had about simultaneity. Like for me, the question is relating maybe also the Ulysses Carrion. Like my question is about like community that is not perceived as something, the community that is not compact, but somehow related in a mind way. Whether these artists were maybe thinking about this through mail art also, kind of like community that is based on not really being together, but being through contact and communication together. Whether that had maybe this kind of level of intersubjectivity, spiritual intersubjectivity, or so maybe it's too complex.
Was a question to David and? Okay, I was just guessing that there was a question at the back. Is this to which talk? David. Shall we collect it and then we can have a round of answers? Okay.
I found very interesting your contextualization of Epstein's work in relation to the art. I wanted to ask also about, the dimension that came out subsequently in his work more strongly, which is this kind of futural dimension, and the more recent work where he's posited the notion, I think I've got it right, of culturtronics, which involves almost a kind of neo-futurist practice of neologism, where the concept creates the possibility of some sort of cultural invention, which I see also, I think, in the creation of these categories of the new sectarianism as well, that they represented in some ways not only a relationship to the present, but also a kind of positing of future possibilities in this sort of nominalistic and neologistic inventive way.
And if I can add two small questions to Mela and Henar. The question to Henar is a bit frivolous in the sense that it doesn't really cut to the core of your talk, but you mentioned the utopian dimension in Maciunas' thinking, and also how he thought that Fluxus would be a tool for communism to triumph over capitalism. What did he really mean in that? And Mela, at the end of your presentation, you were showing the images and said that you came across this in the archive, or that's what you were said. But I was curious to think that what sense could you make of these in the lack of maybe a thorough knowledge of the context?
Okay, so there was a question about parapsychology, and in the Soviet context there were lots of historians that are particularly interested in the way in which Soviet military was doing experiments with various forms of telepathy and so on. So that's being quite well worked through. And I suppose I'm kind of attracted to that in the sense that it breaks down that kind of binary between science and the esoteric, which I think one could really fruitfully explore in the Soviet context and perhaps more widely across Eastern Europe. I think it would be very interesting to kind of gather people to try and think about how these esoteric knowledges of, even that word's rather loaded, but in shorthand, how they really come to structure kind of intellectual lives of artists and writers. It'd be a great big project to do that. And then sort of Epstein today, absolutely. What I'm trying to do as much as possible is to keep the textual sources I'm working with from the periods that is historically coincident with the artworks, partly to avoid that kind of problem of importing Western critical theory that comes in late in Epstein's career in the late 80s. He's able to do that very well. But I think your point's really well made, that there's a kind of legacy of his earlier thinking which is still being played out today, which has these strands of utopianism, but also these kind of concerns with the plasticity of language that I would like to see as being a product of his kind of Soviet formation as much as his readings of Jean Baudrillard or whatever. So he's a really interesting character in that light.
Can I go? Well, it was a very... Yeah, I'll try to answer both. Yeah, no, I just wanted to say it was a very interesting exercise because it showed how misleading an archive research can be if you have no context, no? And as I said, I mean, this could be the object of a very long talk, but it has a lot to do with issues of decontextualization and how can you bring the gap as from the archive position into that. One of the things that I was really surprised about was how personal the letters were very often and how emotional in many senses, with the feeling of, you got the feeling that many people who were writing them, or those artists who were writing them, were looking for a kind of a buddy, I don't know, somebody who would share the same attitudes towards art. And the letters were written from a pretty serious sense of isolation, I think, of intellectual isolation, I think. So this, in terms of archive management, leads me to the question, what happens when the whole generation of people who kind of produce this archive or this network is no longer there? What will happen in 100 years when people are confronted with these kind of networks and the emotional part is completely gone because there's nobody to remind us of that? Or how can you preserve that in an archive if you want to keep it? And this is something that connects very much with, for instance, LTGB archival practices and the personal part of documentation. How do you preserve that if you want to preserve that? That's one thing. The other thing is, this idea of cross-fertilization. You can have a look at documents and from a completely different perspective that has nothing or very little to do with what they were made for, and then see different things. No, I was fascinated by how beautiful many of the letters were as objects, and this again leads to the danger of fetishization of documentation, which is also always in a player in the field. So there are many different things. I mean, I could talk for a long time about that. And in terms of intersubjectivity, I think it's a little bit the same. I mean, I'm impressed by how much of personal and emotional content was part of the network. Not only, there were no big art issues being discussed or anything. It was more some sort of touching, of emotional touching, trying to see if there was somebody at the other side in many of the instances that I've read. But of course, a more thoroughly researched would probably kind of nuance this a little bit. I don't know.
Well, there are many things to say about it. Maybe I connect both of your questions. If I tell you that actually both Maciunas and Xiaomi's utopia, because in a way hers was also a utopia, just she didn't think that she could have a different political system through it, but in a way both of them came to their works through the surprise that was for them to discover that there were other people all around the globe or the northern hemisphere doing things similar to each other, which at the time were very special, very rare, very weird even. They were kind of very there was a huge affinity among people working in different places of the world without knowing from each other. And this is the starting point for Xiaoming's projects, but it's also the starting point for Machuna's becoming like the leader or organizer or whatever you want to call him of Fluxus. So the very idea of Fluxus comes from the discovery of this pre-network of people working very similarly. And the utopia, Machuna's utopia was, it really was very crazy, but he really thought that the fact that there were all those people doing those similar things, if he will coordinate them all, then they will be able to really politically change the world. But because his idea was to get all these people working under the auspices of the Soviet political power. So he wanted to get the Fluxus people working for the authorities in the Soviet Union, which of course nobody wanted to do in Fluxus. But it is said that he went as far as sending letters to Khrushchev there were changes going on also in the Soviet Union, and he thought it was the right moment to intervene, to get connected to the political power there. It sounds crazy, but he really thought it was possible. And the thing about networks and intersubjectivity and so on, this is also like the kind of network-based projects many artists did, so like the special poem by Xiaomi, but also many later projects by Ulysses Carrion and so on. Art projects where actually authorship is like put into question totally. So I'm talking all the time about Xiaomi's project. Well, it is her project, but she herself is talking about how does she call it? Well, a collective poem or an anonymous poem. And well, there are many, many cases in Mela projects of this kind of thing. And what Mela said about people looking for bodies to talk to is, for example, very important with Latin American artists that in the 60s, 70s, 80s were living under very strong dictatorships, and they did not have other means to connect to the world than through the post. And even some of them ended up in jail because of sending cards or letters. So, but anyways, this was a way for them to be connected. So.